When you choose to study journalism, you have a vast array of opportunities awaiting you out there. Elisabet started as a journalist and documentary producer, and over time she gathered experience in safety issues pertaining journalists in the field. Today, she directs a coalition of organizations, freelance journalist associations and NGOs, who work together to champion safe and responsible journalistic practices. Elisabet, you have the floor.
My name is Elisabet Cantenys, and I lead an organization called the NGOs Alliance, which stands for a culture of safety. We are an NGO promoting safe journalism around the world.
By safe journalism, what do you mean?
Well, journalism is under threat. Increasingly, we see journalists being threatened, harassed, killed, kidnapped, imprisoned. And our job is to very much focus on how we can empower these journalists and the news organizations to prevent these to happen. So to empower them to work in safety and to be able to do their very vital work for our democracies.
That's really, really a good idea and a necessary one. So in practical terms, what does your service consist of for the journalists on the field?
Sure. So in very practical terms, it means creating opportunities for journalists to access safety training, to learn how they can do risk assessments, how they can access insurance, how they can adopt basic best practices that can help them to prepare for some of the most difficult assignments.
Okay, so is it like in parallel with any training and preparation that they might receive from their company or from, their own country?
Right, so this is a very good question. Ideally, we would like to see how news organizations have built in the safety provision, and they are providing safety training to all the journalists that need. So the reality is that it's not happening. Only a few leading organizations actually are providing that service to the journalists. And often the local journalists and the freelancers, those are more vulnerable, are left behind. So part of the work that we do in providing this very practical support is also advocate for news organizations to embrace this culture of safety and to provide all the necessary measures to make sure that their journalists are able to do their work, as safe as possible. I mean, covering Ukraine right now, it is in the nature of the job. There is a risk implied, and all the journalists that are working there assume this risk is in the nature of the job. There's a difference between going there, being unprepared without having the experience and the resources, and being there, going there with all the resources that you need, with experience, with the knowledge. It can be sort of life or death.
Right. And so in the example of Ukraine, which is very relevant in our present days, what are the resources that a journalist would need to apply or embrace in order to feel safe and to be safe?
Well, Ukraine, it's what we call an old school war. And our recommendation would be, aside of having safety training, insurance, PPE, which refers to personal protection equipment, with a helmet, and all the protective equipment that you may need in the context of a war. On top of that, we also think it's important to have experience. You may have everything on this checklist, but we believe that journalists that have not experienced a war or hostile environment should be kind of like prepare themselves, don't go from 0 to 1. And this is something that we teach like new graduates or, sort of newcomers to our profession, that you need to pace yourself first, that you need to understand how you're going to react, that you need to understand how you can better prepare for the most traumatic scenarios. And there is one very specific thing that we include in that understanding of safety, which is psychological safety. How you can be in the right place and how you can build your resilience in order to do what you are set out to do.
Okay. So let's backtrack a little bit here because you said it's your own organization. So you had the idea to create this organization.
Well, I wouldn't say it's my organization or that I had the idea. I wish that was true. But no, it was a collective movement, I would say. These happen as a direct result of Syria and the killings of Jim Foley and Steve Sodloff, two freelancers that were killed in 2014 in Syria. And that really shocked our community. I was already working in this space, and it shocked our community, and it really prompted for the ACOS Alliance to come about. There was a group of editors and press freedom advocates that came together right after and put together this document called Freelance Journalist Safety Principles, which is a very practical code of practice for news organizations and for freelance and local journalists, providing that kind of like very clarity on what best practice looks like. And around that, ACOS was created as kind of like the executing arm of those principles. We realized that it wasn't enough to have this code of practice, but actually we had to support the implementation of these best practices. And that's how a group of organizations came about in a very organic way. Before we knew we had the ACOS Alliance, and I'm the first executive director of the Alliance. Yeah.
Okay, so are you a journalist yourself?
I am.
Great, because I have a couple of questions then.
Yes.
So, did you study journalism at university or school?
Yes, I did.
Okay. And how long did you study, and how long did you practice before your current profession, your current job?
Right. So I graduated in 1998. All of a sudden I feel very old. And and yes, I did my bachelor degrees, 4 years, journalism. In my head, I was a straight arrow. I could see myself as a journalist. I dream of being a foreign correspondent one day, and sort of became one. I graduated and I moved to New York, and I became a freelancer there. I worked for several Spanish media, and before I knew, I was producing documentaries. So yeah, and I did that up until 2004, I believe. Yes.
Okay. And then this opportunity came up, or were you looking for something different?
Well, it happened in a very organic way. I wish I could say I planned it, but I didn't.
Okay. Life happens.
Life happens. So I moved to London from New York, and gosh, I moved to London having no idea what I wanted to do next. I knew what I didn't want to do.
Okay.
But I had no idea.
Okay, tell me, because it's nice to...
I wanted a change. I didn't necessarily want to continue working on documentaries as much as I loved it. And sometimes I even miss it.
Yeah.
But yes, I somehow wanted a change when I moved to London, and I was very lost. And I remember by coincidence, I met a friend of a friend. When you move to a new place, you kind of like look who knows who and who can I kind of like connect with. And I met for coffee, and this friend of a friend, after meeting for an hour, at the end, she really opened her agenda and said to me, listen, these are my contacts. How can I help you? Who do you want to meet? And it was so generous of her. And we went through, I was like, well, I don't know who you know, so let's run through it. So we spent quite a lot of time running through it. And among those contacts was an organization called the Rory Peck Trust, an NGO that worked to support journalists in an emergency situation.
Okay.
And I contact them sort of out of the blue, saying, this person, and in case you're looking for someone, I'm here. We'd love to meet you anyways. And they respond me very quickly, and they were looking for someone to volunteer. And to be honest, I was so lost at that time that I was like, oh yeah, I can volunteer, and while I find myself, I'm just going to do this. I never ever imagined that this would become my passion and that this would come. I didn't even know what the job was. You know what I mean?
Okay.
I knew it involved journalism. I knew it was a good cause. But I started in this organization. It was very small. We were, I keep saying always, like when I started in this organization based in London, we were like 3 people and 2 computers almost.
Okay.
And 12 years later, I was the head of programs and we had a team of 12, 14 people. And yeah, we were doing incredible work and we were supporting, more than 100 individuals a year that were at the peak of a crisis, journalists that were arrested or had to flee their country. And I got addicted to this job. It felt so fulfilling. And that's how I kind of like enter a new space. I think one of the things that I missed at university, and I'm very proud of the education that I had, is that we seem to have, and I don't know whether that's something that it's imposed on students or was me, but I had a very tunnel vision of my future. Like I was studying journalism and I couldn't imagine that there are a variety of other professions and things that you can do where you can use the same skills that can be equally exciting and fulfilling. I didn't know that back then.
Yeah, and this is a really important point because sometimes the choices are so funneled, but you don't know what that road where it could lead you. And this is also the reason why back then I didn't choose journalism, because all I was thinking was written journalism, and I felt I was not strong enough for writing. I didn't enjoy writing, but I never thought of the video journalism. So in your case, because this is also a big issue that young people face when they have to decide what to do next. When you were saying, I'm lost. In your case, how did you choose journalism? And can you explain a little bit about that process?
I had a little bit the opposite of you in the sense that I like writing and I love reading. So it seemed like a good choice. I must say, there were 2 things, well, several things, of course, that I loved. But I loved art back then. I loved traveling and sort of like discovering new things. And I felt like journalism could be a vehicle for that. I saw journalism as the door to, being able to travel and being able to meet other people and to understand things and to learn and to feed my curiosity. I felt like journalism was something where you keep sort of learning new realities and you have exclusive access to stories and to people. And I was very attracted by that.
Okay, and in your experience, like, would you say that it's important to have journalism studies before you start a job or your professional life, or could it also be like a job that you learn by doing?
Yes, I don't think it's an essential thing. I didn't know better. I thought that was the way to do it, and I'm very happy. And I'm very proud of my bachelor's degree. I felt when I graduated that I was in a good place. I had done internships that sort of like built or confirmed that I was in the right place and reassured me. But I don't think it's the only path to journalism. There are so many paths, and you can choose to approach journalism from whichever theme you're passionate about, whether it's the environment, whether it's fashion or art or international relations, and you can access journalism from that. And I think that's the beauty of journalism, that there is that openness and you can come from many different places, I think, and you can still be a great journalist without having gone to J school.
Right. Okay. And looking at your, the contacts to journalisms today in the organizations where you work, how do you know the journalists that will need help? Do they come to you? Is it a well-known organization, or do you reach out? And you were talking about maybe 100 journalists in your past experience. Is it how do you find your say customers? If we want to say
Right.
your target
Right.
people.
Well, I'm kind of like going to do a little bit of a detour, if you allow me.
Please.
I think it's very different what I was doing in my previous job as head of programs in this other organization where I was doing reactive work. And in that case, basically, something bad needed to happen for us to help you. And there are a lot of organizations out there that do amazing work monitoring attacks on press. And that was a major source of information back then in understanding who had been attacked. With time, one of the things that I did and I enjoy the most was actually building relationships with organizations around the world. So I did a great deal of traveling and connecting with those organizations, making trustworthy and solid relationships with these organizations. So when something would happen, they knew that they could reach out to us, and we would do our best to support. And one of the great things that we did is that when we couldn't help, we would really find someone who could help. We just didn't want to leave anyone behind. And in a way that also expanded our network of contacts. So that's kind of I would say, sort of my role then. But I also, after 12 years of doing that, I became increasingly frustrated that, again, something bad needed to happen before I could help, before we could help. And that's still needed by all means. But I was interviewing, talking with some of these journalists, and none of them had insurance. None of them had done, or most of them had not done safety training. Most of them didn't have a risk assessment plan. It was, the basic things that could have avoided for that tragedy to happen. And and that's why, these sort of what was happening in my mind happened at the same time of Syria. Syria was, I think, a big moment for a lot of us because it was really hard to cope with what was happening. And when the discussions around the ACOS Alliance became, it really fed me into understanding that, gosh, I can be working on something that can be proactive, that can maybe save preventive. Someone. Yes. And that I gave me renewed energy, I think, from the job that I was doing. And what we're doing, how we find our customers. I like that question. So again, we have a wide network of contacts. We have more than 130 signatories to the ACOS principles, to the freelance journalist safety principles. We are active on social media. So part of our work is to make ourselves heard on what we are advocating, what we are campaigning for, but also to offer those opportunities whenever, we are organizing the training or we have partner organizations that are able to offer it, or, there is anything going on that can actually help our community.
Okay, and if I understand correctly, now your job is less of a journalistic nature per se, you don't write any more, pieces and stuff, but it's really organizational and, preparation of trainings, or you maybe give trainings yourself. What is it that you do on a daily basis?
Well, I do sometimes, I miss writing and I wish I had the time. And sometimes, I write I get invited to write an op-ed or an article, and I love doing it. I don't do it enough. But yes, you're absolutely right. My days are filled with conversations with actual individual freelance journalists or local journalists, editors and news organizations interested in how they can become more aware on how they can empower themselves to implement some of the safety practices that we advocate for. A lot of conversations with partner organizations, how we strategize. I really believe that the challenges that we have are much larger than anyone of us individually. And that's why ACOS is an alliance. So we are not, by ourselves.
Right.
It's very much, coming together as a coalition. So there's a great deal of working with others. And I'm not a journalist, but I see myself using all the time my journalist skills, interviewing people and making connections. And the other thing that I find is an extremely good advantage of being a journalist is that I am talking with journalists most of the times. And there is a complicity when I say I am a journalist myself. I've been a freelancer and I haven't been luckily in any position of great danger before, but I can empathize and I do share the language of journalism. I do understand their passion and their commitment to the stories that they tell. And I do understand that they are, sometimes putting their lives at risk because of that passion. So I think that empathy has really opened many doors in my job, and I still use what I've learned in sort of my studies, but also my experience as a journalist. I still introduce myself as a journalist when people, because it's a little bit difficult to explain what I do. So, when you are in a party or when you get introduced to someone, sometimes I get, I use a shortcut and I say I'm a journalist. And if they want to know more, then I tell them more. But I see myself still as a journalist.
Okay. So for someone who would like to be a journalist, but work in your line of work, what would be the best skills that they could be achieving it or aiming at, let's say?
I think our sector is really open to anyone who's committed to press freedom, freedom of expression, human rights. So you definitely, I was saying how great it is that I have that background in journalism, but definitely you don't need to be a journalist to work in our sector. If you're young and you're interested, I think, volunteering or landing yourself an internship, it's a great way to have firsthand taste of what we do. I think it's intoxicating what we do. You get a bug because it's very rewarding to see the impact of what we're doing almost on a daily basis, how we are helping individuals, and that's very powerful. So I think if you're young and you're trying to understand whether this is the place where you want to be, I would say find yourself an internship or volunteering and see where it takes you.
Okay. And if you could find, if you had to pick one most difficult part of your job, what would it be?
Definitely to deal with the psychological stress of our work. We are dealing with people that are most of the times at the peak of a crisis, or they are about to cover a very difficult, story. And there is a lot of empathy through the struggles that they encounter. And I think it's human. There is that empathy and you also suffer.
You feel for them, yeah.
You feel for them. And if you've been long enough, like I've been in this space, sooner or later you will have actually people that that are getting killed or people that that are being imprisoned. And it becomes personal, and it's how it's supposed to be. We're all human. And there is this idea that actually they are the ones who are suffering, and you're kind of like saying to yourself, it's not for me to be in pain, or it's not for me to complain about the stress that I have, because I ultimately I am privileged. I live in safety. So I wasn't aware of these when I started, and it only built up through the years that I was doing a lot of the emergency support.
Right.
And I realized how the impact that it has. And only recently you learn a little bit more about self-care, and you're aware about, what you are being exposed. And it hasn't deterred me, because it's still, I think the balance is positive, and
Right.
I think our job is so needed and ultimately so rewarding. But this is the one thing that I wasn't aware when I started, and sometimes it's difficult to deal with, and sometimes it's also
Okay.
to witness colleagues dealing with it. I had recently an exchange with colleagues where some were sharing some of the situation that is happening in Iran, and it was extremely moving to
Yeah.
see how some of these colleagues are suffering.
One last question for you is that
Yeah.
is it a job that you can do online, having a lot of this new digital nomad life?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, there is, I used to travel a lot before COVID.
Yeah.
And then we realized with COVID that you can do a great deal online.
Yeah.
And I am based in Barcelona. My organization is registered in New York. And I work with a pool of international colleagues in many different parts of the world. And I love it that we can connect, and we can, you need to have that flexibility in your schedule. And ultimately you need to be able to travel, because there is nothing like meeting face to face and to connect in that sense.
Yeah,
But definitely it's something that
definitely.
you can do online. Yes.
Super. Well, I want to thank you a lot for participating, first of all, at the podcast, and for sharing your experience, which is very inspiring, important, and touching at the same time. Thank you, Elisabeth, and I'll let you know when it's online.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
As you can see, there are many applications of what a journalist can achieve during his or her career. If you're a journalist and want to share your own experience, please write me at Jobtalespodcast at gmail.com.